March 1945. A captured German command post near the Rhine River. Rain falls hard on the slate roof. Inside, 30 prisoners sit on long wooden benches. One man does not. He sits on an ornate leather chair he dragged from the commander's office. A young American soldier walks down the row with a clipboard. He stops. He tells the seated man to stand up for the morning head count. The man does not move. Instead, he reaches into his wool coat, pulls out a gold lighter, and ignites a thick cigar. He looks up. He blows a thick cloud of gray smoke directly into the young guard's eyes. He says he does not take orders from commoners. He says he will only speak to an officer of his own bloodline. The American soldier holds his rifle steady. He does not know it yet, but General George S. Patton is already on his way to this compound, and his response to this single gesture will permanently break the old world's pride. This is the story of an arrogant SS officer who tried to look down on an American soldier, and the devastating lesson George Patton forced him to learn in the mud. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Private First Class Thomas Jenkins was 21 years old. He came from a dirt farm in Oklahoma. He belonged to the 89th Infantry Division. Before the war, his world was bounded by dry soil, failed crops, and the steady work of his own hands. He had enlisted because his family needed the service pay. But the European theater had taken a different kind of toll. He had watched his best friend step on a landmine outside of Metz. He had survived the freezing nights of the Ardennes with nothing but a single woolen blanket. Now, his boots were held together by gray duct tape, and he had not tasted a hot meal in 5 days. His hands were raw from the biting cold, but he maintained strict discipline. He kept his right finger resting firmly off the trigger guard, refusing to let his exhaustion show to the men he was guarding. He stood in the damp air, holding his heavy rifle on the prisoners for 10 straight hours, anchoring himself to the floor as he faced down the man in the leather chair. General Major Karl von Weber was 55 years old. He was an SS general from an ancient aristocratic family in East Prussia. He believed with absolute certainty that military rank was a divine right passed down through noble bloodlines, and he viewed the advancing American forces as uncultured mongrels who had no right to occupy his soil. He openly refused to sit on the rough wooden stools provided for the other prisoners, demanding a proper armchair from the local staff. His uniform was perfectly tailored, free of mud, and adorned with a pristine glass monocle. On his left hand, a silver death's head ring caught the dim light of the command post. He believed that a man of his high lineage should never take orders from a common laborer, and he looked at the young guard with pure disgust. By March 1945, the Allied advance had completely shattered the western borders of the German Reich. The Rhine River was no longer a defensive barrier, but a breakthrough point where entire divisions of the Wehrmacht were disintegrating by the hour. Roads were choked with retreating vehicles, discarded weapons, and thousands of bewildered soldiers throwing up their hands in surrender. This mass collapse created an administrative nightmare for the advancing American units, who suddenly found themselves managing vast numbers of prisoners with very little infrastructure. Regular infantry units were pulled from the front lines simply to establish makeshift holding areas in captured town halls, schoolhouses, and abandoned command posts. In the chaos of this rapid occupation, the strict social boundaries of the old European military tradition were thoroughly smashed. In previous encounters during the European campaign, many Allied officers had chosen to overlook minor displays of arrogance from high-ranking captives. Bussy tactical commanders, focused entirely on maintaining the speed of the advance, frequently allowed senior German officers to retain small privileges, such as separate quarters or private luggage, simply to keep the peace and expedite interrogations. This passive leniency had fostered an environment where captured aristocrats genuinely believed their status would be preserved, even in total defeat. They expected the Americans to respect the ancient rules of social class and continental military hierarchy, completely misjudging the nature of the army that had just broken their lines. The breakdown of logistics combined with the sheer volume of prisoners, meant that elite commanders were now forced into close contact with ordinary American conscripts who cared nothing for European titles. The stage was set for a direct confrontation between these competing worlds inside the damp, crowded room near the river. An American military police captain walked into the damp room holding a clipboard. He looked at the head count sheet, then looked at the seated German officer. He adjusted his helmet and stepped closer. "Stand up for the head count." "General," the captain said. The German officer did not move. He slowly exhaled a thick cloud of cigar smoke toward the ceiling. "I do not think you understand who I am, Captain," the German answered. "I know exactly who you are," the captain said, looking at his sheet. "You are a prisoner of war in an American sector, and the regulations require every man to stand when the roll is called." "Regulations are written for the common masses," the German said, adjusting his glass monocle. "They do not apply to me." The captain tapped his pen against the wooden clipboard, keeping his voice flat. "The rules apply to everyone in this compound, General, from the lowest private to the highest officer. No exceptions." The German leaned back into his leather armchair and smiled coldly. "That is the fundamental flaw of your entire nation. You believe a farm boy from the wilderness is equal to a man whose ancestors ruled land before your country even existed. I am a noble by blood and a general by right. I do not take orders from commoners, and I certainly do not stand for them." The captain took a slow breath. He looked at the young private standing guard by the door, then back at the arrogant man in the tailored uniform. "You are delaying the procedure, General," the captain said. "Stand up now." "I will stand when an officer of my own social standing enters this room," the German replied, tapping the ash from his cigar onto the muddy floor. "I will speak only with a commander who understands the dignity of noble blood. Until then, you and your peasant guards can wait." The captain looked at the pristine silver death's head ring on the general's finger. He realized this went far beyond a simple refusal to cooperate. The German was deliberately challenging the very basis of American military authority in front of dozens of prisoners. The captain knew he could not force the man down without causing a riot in the crowded room. This was an ideological stand, and it required a decision from someone higher up the chain of command. He turned on his heel and walked out into the rain. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. Mud clung to his high leather boots as he stepped inside the crowded room. The loud chatter stopped instantly. Every American soldier snapped to rigid attention. The prisoners looked up in silence. Patton's voice was quiet, but it carried. He did not yell. He walked directly to the center of the floor and stopped 3 feet from the leather armchair. He studied the seated German officer for a cold, silent moment. "Why are you sitting down, General?" Patton asked. "I am waiting for an officer who understands my position," the German answered. "Do you know what your position is right now?" Patton asked. "I am a noble prisoner of war," the German said, touching his glass monocle. Patton stepped closer, his face completely expressionless. "You are a captive whose army is currently bleeding to death in the mud outside this door." The German leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "My rank was given by birth and blood, not by the grace of commoners. I do not answer to peasants." "You believe your family crest protects you from the reality of defeat," Patton said. "You believe the dirt on an American private's boots makes him your inferior. You think your tailored wool uniform sets you apart from the men who just broke your lines. You sit in a stolen chair and blow smoke at a soldier who has fought through the winter to clear you out of this country. Rank in my army is earned in blood, not given by birth." Patton growled. "We do not bow to titles, and we do not tolerate aristocrats who treat our soldiers like dirt. You are not a nobleman here. You are a defeated combatant who will obey the rules of this compound. You have a choice," Patton said. "You will stand on your feet right now and join the rest of these men, or you will face a consequence that will strip away every ounce of your family pride before the sun goes down today. Decide now." The German general looked at Patton's ivory revolvers, then at the crowded room of prisoners watching him. He slowly put out his cigar against the armrest and stood up. Patton turned away from the general and looked directly at the American military police captain. He gave his instructions in a clear, flat voice that echoed off the damp stone walls. The punishment was carried out immediately in full view of every man in the compound. 2 American guards grabbed the heavy leather armchair and dragged it out into the center of the muddy courtyard, leaving it completely exposed to the heavy rain. The general was then forced to march out into the open air and stand at rigid attention directly beside the empty chair. He stood in the deep mud, his pristine uniform quickly soaking through, his polished leather boots sinking into the wet earth. For the next 7 days, the courtyard became a theater of reversed authority. Patton issued a strict written order that was posted on the command board. Every single time Private Jenkins entered or left the holding area, the proud German general was forced to snap his heels together and deliver a full, crisp military salute to the young farmer from Oklahoma. Private Jenkins was instructed by his commander to casually ignore the gesture, walking past the shivering officer until he felt like returning it. The other German prisoners watched from the windows in absolute silence as their aristocratic commander saluted the torn, duct-taped boots of a common laborer day after day in the freezing mud. Private First Class Thomas Jenkins returned to Oklahoma after the war ended. He went back to the dirt farm, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 4 children on the same land his father had worked. He never kept a journal, and he rarely spoke about his time in Europe to his neighbors or his family. He lived a quiet, industrious life as a mechanic, dying in 1993 at the age of 69. The only item he kept from his entire military service was a small, pocket-sized calendar from March 1945, which he kept locked in a wooden desk drawer until the day he passed away. General Major Karl von Weber stood trial before an Allied military tribunal in late 1946. He was convicted of minor war crimes related to his commands and served 6 years in a penal facility before being released. He returned to a radically changed Germany, living out his remaining days in a small apartment in Hamburg. He never recovered his family lands or his former social standing, spending his final years writing bitter, unpublished memoirs about the collapse of the old order. He died quietly in 1974, entirely forgotten by the world he had tried so hard to dominate. General Patton himself never mentioned the incident in his public briefings or his official wartime correspondence. He kept the military police report filed away in the bottom of his personal field desk, alongside hundreds of other minor disciplinary records from the European campaign. He mentioned the confrontation only once, in a brief private letter written to his wife just before the final push across Germany. In that letter, he remarked that the true strength of an army does not come from ancestral crests or ancient privileges, but from the ordinary men who stand firm when everything else falls apart. Some historians have argued that Patton's mirrored punishments were unnecessarily theatrical, designed more to satisfy his own sense of personal drama than to serve true military utility. They suggest that forcing an enemy general into such a public spectacle did little to change the strategic outcome of the war, and risked violating the standard conventions governing the dignified treatment of senior prisoners of war. Others have argued the exact opposite, defending the action as a brilliant and necessary psychological tool. They maintain that confronting deep-seated aristocratic arrogance directly was the only way to shatter the enemy's belief in their inherent superiority and to firmly establish absolute authority over thousands of captives in a chaotic, rapidly expanding occupation zone. What is certain is that the written order remained a matter of record within the regiment for decades, serving as a permanent historical marker of the exact moment when ancient European class structures finally collided with the uncompromising reality of the modern world. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have transferred the general to a different compound to avoid the confrontation? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.